What I've noticed is I think a lot of NPs come to the idea of practice ownership with a particular goal, right? They may have a goal of just replacing their salary from their full-time job or being able to cut back to part-time hours, right? And I think that maybe not a lot of NPs know what is possible there. I know several NPs who have owned practices that have scaled up to multi-million dollar operations. So, when we're talking about NP practices from a compliance standpoint, there's a few different buckets that I like to think of. The first bucket has to do with your business entity and practice ownership. So, that relates to who can legally own your practice. Are you able to own your practice in your state? So, that's practice ownership. And then alongside that is medical oversight, meaning, do you need to have a physician engaged in your business or in your practice somehow? And if so, how? And both of those buckets have different state to state regulations. I think it can
Okay.
be a common misconception that, oh, adding more providers will result in my business growing, which isn't necessarily the case unless those providers are bringing their own patients. Because ultimately, a provider that you have on staff needs to be revenue generating, right? Nurse practitioners in general, we're revenue generating providers. So in order for there to be more money brought to the practice from another provider, there needs to be patients, right?
Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome back to Scaling Practice Management, the show where we help practice managers grow smarter, not harder. My name is Jakub Grajcar. The transcript the Riverside provides of this never gets this right, but my name is Jakub Grajcar. I'm the head of marketing at Talkie AI, where we help medical practices stop the phone from ringing off the hook and unburden their front desk team with our AI medical receptionist agents, and we're already helping 300,000 patients every month. My guest today is Amanda. I messed up the first name. Amanda Guarniere. Amanda, hi, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining the show. I must have had like one coffee too many today, but we're gonna manage. So, a couple words about Amanda. Amanda is a Yale-educated nurse practitioner with 15 years of clinical experience and the VP of Enterprise Partnerships, newly minted, at Guardian MD, a service that provides collaborating physicians and medical directors to practices, along with a compliance infrastructure around them. And I feel like compliance is definitely going to be one of the topics for today. Amanda also owns her own private practice focused on wellness and aesthetics, and she founded the Resume RX, a resource that has helped thousands of nurses and NPs navigate their careers. Amanda, welcome to the show, and how do you manage it all? Let's start there.
Sometimes I wonder that myself. Believe it or not, I do get a good 7 hours of sleep every night. But I've got a lot of balls in the air, and I like to use this example of figuring out of the balls in the air, which are glass and which are plastic. And every once in a while, I let a plastic ball fall because I also have 3 kids and a husband and a house. But I like to keep busy. What can I say?
Can you say just a couple words more about that? Because I know the concept, but like for people hearing this for the first time, what do you mean glass balls?
Yeah, so, common phrase of juggling a lot of balls in the air, right? And so if you kind of picture yourself juggling, some of the balls are glass, meaning that if you were to drop one of those balls, something would break. It would really be bad. Bad things would happen. Versus if some of those balls are plastic, when they fall, they just bounce, right? So I may have grand plans of cooking my family dinner every night or making sure that my kids are dressed in the right spirit day outfit. Those are plastic balls. Sometimes those I let those fall if I've got other priorities in the air. So it's just kind of a constant priority triage in my brain between work and home responsibilities.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, especially in healthcare, can relate to that. And yeah, and in terms of cooking, you want to get it right, but if not, there's always pizza, right? And that that really takes us into the next segment here, which is the warm-up game. I feel like we're plenty warmed up already, but let's play the game either way. So I have got 10 categories of questions, and from those 10, first we'll pick three. So could you give me three numbers from 1 to 10?
Let's go with 5, 7, and 8.
5, 7, and 8. Okay, so the categories I picked are pets, weekend, and movie. Which one do you want?
Pets.
Pets. So, do you have any pets? Do they have any unique habits? Tell us about your pets.
So I have 2 pets. I have a black cat named Cricket and
Awesome.
a miniature Bernedoodle dog named Pepper. Pepper is a puppy, and
Okay.
she's about well, she'll be 2 in a few days. So they are just a lot of fun.
Okay. So what's the relationship like between them? Like, who's the boss of the 2?
So Pepper the dog always wants to play with Cricket the cat. Cricket
Yeah.
wants absolutely nothing to do with the dog. So they're constantly getting into little spats and arguments, and the cat is hissing and throwing her paws at the dog, and it's just the dog has a special bark that she only barks at the cat. So wherever you are in the house, you know when they're, in an argument because you never hear that dog's bark any other time.
Yeah, that's so cool. That is so unique. It's funny with pets and their sounds. Like I used to have a cat, and just recently I was taking a walk, and there were two guys taking two cats out of the car, and they were meowing. But I read once that cats evolution is from an evolutionary standpoint, kind of evolved to use their make their meows similar to like the cry of a human child, so that humans would take care of them. And those were, like, at the very far end of the curve because it was sounding just like a baby, Like,
I give you
are we
that.
sure these are the right species there? So, yeah, I absolutely, absolutely understand your point. Awesome, awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
That's great. I got such a big smile on my face already. The watchers see this, the listeners are now informed, and I'm really excited to launch into our episode. So, to continue the scaling practice management tradition, the first question you'll get is the same one everybody gets. Amanda, what is your number one tip for successfully growing a healthcare practice? Let's start there.
I would say my number one tip is to know and understand who your future patients are going to be so that you can attract them. I think, from my work for my own practice and with other practice owners that I've supported, this often is an afterthought, but I really think it should be on the forefront of everyone's mind. How are you going to reach the patients that you want to serve? Everything else may be complicated in terms of starting the actual entity and picking out your build out. All those things may seem like the priority, but at the end of the day, how are patients going to find you is what I think is what you need to lead with.
Okay. And what do you think are some of the options here? Like, how would you go about doing that? Are there particular questions within that question that you should ask yourself? Like, how does it break down?
Yeah, I think that if you're designing a new practice from scratch, thinking about what your expertise is, who you want to help, and seeing how far you can narrow that down, and really define who that ideal patient avatar is, if you will, and making sure that you are creating an experience and a practice and messaging that really attracts that person and repels all the others, so that you have clarity around then what the specific marketing activities are that you will need to do because I don't think there are many practice owners who are so fortunate that they just have a constant stream of inbound patients when they're starting
Sure.
something from scratch, and those that do, it may not be the right patients. So I think this work is valuable as you can continue to actually build a practice that is what you've envisioned.
Yeah. And is that something that you've also done for your own practice? You've done some thinking about like who is the type of patient you want to attract?
Definitely. And it's something that I've put a lot of thought into and that I really try to mirror in my activities. Just to give an example, I tend to attract patients who are in a similar life stage as myself. So I'm
Uh-huh.
a nearly 40-year-old mom living in the suburbs of Connecticut, and when I am planning my messaging and my outreach and my marketing activities, I'm trying to reach others who are like me because of the services I provide are very applicable to my avatar. So my one of my primary marketing activities is I am a sponsor for my kids' school PTA. So it's a you know what I it's a fee that I pay on a regular basis to be included as a sponsor on all their activities. So they're constantly sharing my business. If they have an event, my logo is there. I get invited to have giveaways and things like that. And so I'm effectively hyper targeting my ideal client because I've recognized that my avatar of client is going to get exposure through PTA advertising.
Yeah, I think that's a big advantage, right? When your buyers or your patients in this case are similar to you, you can make the same references, you speak the same language. The answer might be different for for some other people watching and listening, and I think that's important to immerse yourself in in the world of the people that you're targeting. One cool thing I like to do because I've been a marketer for like over 10 years now, is to look at like what are some references I might make that the buyers would or would not understand. So like when were they kids? What are the cartoons or like
Mm,
the books that they would recognize from their own youth? Just also so I keep myself in check, that if I'm trying to go for humor or if I'm trying to be somehow relevant or relatable to them, like what's gonna land versus what's gonna fly over their heads. Because
mhm.
yeah, I mean you would think that, everything is gonna be relatable to everybody else, but it is very much not like that. I'm a millennial, right? So anything and then now when I'm looking at like the Gen Z generation, the stuff that they're nostalgic about, I'm seeing that content already somewhere on my feed and I'm like, I've never heard of this. And there's already nostalgia about it. Oops.
Yeah.
It's
Nostalgia
really
is
different.
it's such a generational and unique experience, but it's so defining and so emotionally charged, right? As a fellow millennial, I know exactly what you mean.
Millennials unite. If you're a millennial, drop a comment, like, subscribe, follow us, and email me that you love the show. Anyway, moving moving on. So yeah, and I just did this on the previous episode, but I'm gonna drop this book again. Building a story brand would be really cool for this to kind of think about the brand of your practice. I don't have any affiliation with them, but I just really love the book, and this really slots well into what you shared here as your number one tip. So thank you for sharing that.
No.
And now let's get immersed into your world, shall we, Amanda? So you've got kind of two hats on, right? You run your own practice as an NP, and you work at Guardian MD, helping other practices stay compliant. And could you tell us how you got here? What this transition from treating patients to also running a business look like for you? What's the story there?
Sure. So I have been an NP for 15 years now. And when I first started out, I had a very traditional clinical trajectory. So I worked many years in full-time clinical care, mostly in emergency medicine was my primary area of practice. And later in my career, maybe about 7 years in, I found myself working part time after having twins. And so I was working part time clinically and exploring other ways to use my expertise. And that is when I founded an educational company, the Resume RX, which was really meant to help nurses and nurse practitioners with career strategy, job interviews, resumes, etc. So I ended up building a fairly successful online platform and online business there, which I learned a lot about sales and marketing because that really had to be at the forefront of building my own company. And so after building that, I was able to position myself in a really interesting position to go into not working for myself, working for other companies in the sales and marketing space. And the fact that I am a clinician with a clinical background and also have experience in sales and marketing has proven
Yeah.
to be a really cool intersection of two different worlds that creates a bit of a unicorn skill set. So I have been working for Guardian MD for a little over a year now, and I have been working in the medical oversight space for about 3 years in similar roles of sales and marketing leadership. And that's my primary focus. So I'm full time working for Guardian as my primary role, and I still love having doing patient care. So a few years ago, I started my own practice so that I could mainly explore, a specialty area that I wanted to expand upon and also have the freedom and flexibility to work in it part time. So my practice is very part time. I have a physical office, just a single room office. I see patients there probably a handful of days per month, and I do some telehealth as well. But it all happens kind of outside of the typical 9 to 5 workday because I am otherwise wearing my guardian hat during that time.
Yeah, I understand. And in terms of Guardian, how would you explain the business in your own words? Who do you help and how?
Sure. So At Guardian, we help nurse-led clinics. So whether it's a non-medical business owner who is employing nurses or nurse practitioners, or it's those nurses themselves who are the business owners, we
Mhm.
provide a remote medical director, so a remote physician in clinical settings where a physician is not required to be there physically. So we provide not only the physician relationship, but also provide a lot of compliance tools around that in terms of protocols and good faith exams and physician owned practice structure. So, just kind of everything around the medical oversight requirements.
Okay, I understand. Definitely, this thread is going to come up later in the conversation as well. So that's kind of what where I wanted to go next, is to talk about this. About nurse practitioners starting their own business. Let's start with like a general question. What do you think are the biggest traps here, or the things that nurse practitioners don't think about when they start a business? What's probably in their minds, and what probably should also be in there?
It's a great question. I think that nurse practitioners usually come to practice ownership, having clarity around who they want to help, what type of specialty or services they want to provide, maybe a vision of what they want it to look like integrated into their life in terms of, oh, I want to work this many days per week or have this type of office. I think that we as NPs don't get a lot of business training or really any business training in our
Mm,
educational component. So I think that there are a good amount of gaps, and we sometimes don't know what we don't know. So we may not know to consult, for example, a healthcare attorney to see, oh, is a nurse practitioner legally allowed to own a professional LLC in my state, for example, or do I need to look up whether I'm required to have a sink in my exam room. So there are different kind of business related questions and regulations that NPs may not know to ask. Hopefully they've engaged with some sort of mentor, or they know someone who has opened a practice who can help hold their hand along the way, but it's not really centralized information. So a lot of them are kind of piecemealing it together.
yeah. Are there places where that kind of mentorship can be found? I mean, that question just popped in my mind, but like, are there particular sources or organizations for this?
There are a different nurse practitioner entrepreneurship or nurse practitioner in business organizations that I'm aware of, and sometimes our larger national organizations have kind of some carve out education around this,
Hmm.
but not anything that's necessarily a household name. So it can be tricky to find if you don't know where to look.
Understand. And there's something else that I remember from like our previous conversation before the show, where we talked about like the ambition and scale of an NP led business, right? Because I think a lot of NPs come into this who, just want trying to kind of replace their salary. But you told me an interesting story, and I would love to also capture this on the show, of like what's actually possible. That you could take this kind of business and actually turn it into a multi-million dollar business. So what do you think? What's stopping nurse practitioners from thinking in that way? And could we paint a picture of like what's actually possible?
Yes, I love that, and I would love to talk more about that. I think, what I've noticed is I think a lot of NPs come to the idea of practice ownership with a particular goal, right? They may
Mhm.
be moving away from something which might be the discomfort of feeling overworked or working a lot of hours, or they want to make more money. And coming to practice ownership with that goal, they may have a goal of just replacing their salary from their full-time job, or being able to cut back to part-time hours, right? And I think that maybe not a lot of NPs know what is possible there, and I love to be able to share more about that. I know several NPs who have owned practices that have scaled up to multi-million dollar operations. Some are, selling to bigger practice buyers. Some are getting investments. Now, this is not common. I wouldn't say that it's every NP is having this trajectory, but I think if we start to share what's possible, I would hope more NPs will be able to achieve that, because I think sometimes we're limited by what our frame of reference is, and not knowing what's possible. Maybe I'll only be lucky enough to replace my salary, and because that's my goal, I never surpass it, right? So I feel pretty passionate about sharing that message of what's possible, not only to inspire, but also to just help NPs and practice owners in general think bigger.
So I wonder how that breaks down. Well, first of all, I think Maybe that's because we just recorded an episode and published one where that was also one of the threads there with Cornelius Schmal. Look it up, watchers and listeners. But anyway, I thought part of that is the mindset question of it, right? So I wonder, is it more so like a conscious choice that you have to take that actually, yes, I'm going to, because with scaling, it's like your costs go up, your revenue goes up as well. Probably an appetite for risk is part of the equation here. But what do you think is the discerning factor here that separates the ones who scale from the ones who plateau?
Absolutely. I think it's a combination of mindset and vision and
Mhm.
really having some sort of visualization of what's possible and knowing what you're working towards and kind of having that destination and mission. And also understanding the mechanics of from a business perspective, what it takes to get there, right? So, I've talked to a lot of new NP business owners who, for example, make the assumption that the revenue that they generate from their patients all gets to go into their pocket, right? So when they're doing the exercise of how many patients do I need or how much money do I need to make to leave my full-time job, for example, they're assuming that they get to keep all of it, right? And not taking into account, oh, there's overhead expenses, there's costs of goods, there's taxes, all sorts of different categories of things, right? So I think there is definitely some business acumen that needs to be learned. And then doing some modeling based on that, right? Because as you scale, as you see more patients, to keep it really simple, there's a capacity to what one person can do when it comes to the exchange of patient and provider appointments, right? So to in order to get to another point, you're bringing in additional staff, right? You're hiring, and as you continue to hire, your costs go up and your expenses go up, and being able to understand the economics of that, I think, is really essential because then you can model out what it looks like realistically to achieve whatever that next or bigger goal is.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's hard to run a business without at least casually looking at a spreadsheet from time to time, right? It's unavoidable. Thankfully, these days, it's you could use AI, for example, to help with some aspects of that. I mean, it feels like such obvious advice, but honestly, I feel like every time I say something like that, somebody hears this and say, "How have I not thought of applying AI to this problem?" I have these moments all the time when people say, "Well, why didn't you just use ChatGPT for it?" And I say, "Oh, you can use it for that too? Yeah, why not? Let's try it." Right? So it's definitely there. And in terms of vision, I don't know, do you have, like, a favorite way to build a vision, or have you done an exercise like that for yourself, or you really thought, how many years in advance do you even think? Like 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways to approach it. Some And I think it depends on how your mind works and what's important to you and what your main drivers are. Some people are driven by impact, right? I want to help as many patients as possible in whatever field that I'm in. Some people are more motivated by their personal gains or their personal life. So time freedom might be more important to them, or they're rowing towards an early retirement, right? So I think having that, creating space to think about that is really essential. I think that the best thing to do is to take yourself on a little vacation and, turn off the screens, get away from your computer and just create space for your mind to wander and, maybe with a friend or a partner, be able to talk about, okay, what type of life do I want for myself? What type of legacy do I want to lead? I think we many of us are just so ingrained in the day to day that it's really
Yeah.
difficult for us to do that reflection. So sometimes it needs to happen outside of your day to day. And I think most visions really start from there and can work backwards from there. And then part of the exercise, especially if you're starting something from scratch, is of course to think about what your area of expertise is, what your community needs, what might be in demand, and then also take into account what you want for your personal life, and what's important to you outside of work, because that's that sometimes goes a bit under recognized when we're talking about career growth and goals. So, for example, if you're in a season of life where you have young children at home, your time or the hours that you're spending working versus not working, that may be a priority, and that should be
Yeah.
somehow accounted for in in your plan.
Yeah, and it's good to think in advance, like, if you're planning to make that part of your life, for example, you might not have children right now, but you're planning to in 5 years, and, that might influence certain choices. I was just reminded of a book that I read about this called Vivid Vision. It's by
Mhm.
Cameron Herold. I really enjoyed that one, and actually, based on that, I wrote down, like, a very detailed vision for 5 years in advance that, that kind of deadline, so to speak, has passed. But it's a really great exercise of like making statements that are not true today and you would want to be true 5 years from now, and then revisit that. And, even after just 1 year, how many of those false statements turn into true statements? That was really motivating to me when I followed that book. I think there's also a TED talk if you're more, visual oriented or you want to have a condensed version, but I recommend that. That's such an interesting topic. We could stay here forever, I feel like. Although I did want to also pick your brain about some other aspects of like NP-led businesses. So let's take another step on this journey then and talk about compliance, right? So that's also something I remember from like our conversation before the show. Yes, we have conversations before the show, watchers and listeners. We want to give you a nice, condensed, valuable episode. So we do our preparation beforehand. Thanks for asking. So in terms of compliance, it seems like this is the thing that like most NP founders, nurse practitioners founders find out about this too late. So could you like make it simple for us? Like what does an NP actually need legally to own and run a practice? Why is it so confusing? I'm hearing one thing is, it differs state by state. So maybe let's pick a couple of states and see how it might differ. Let's start there.
Sure, sure. So when we're talking about NP practices from a compliance standpoint, there's a few different buckets that I like to think of. The first bucket has to do with your business entity and practice ownership. So that relates to who can legally own your practice. Are you able to own your practice in your state? So that's practice ownership. And then alongside that is medical oversight, meaning do you need to have a physician engaged in your business or in your practice somehow? And if so, how? And both of those buckets have different state to state regulations. So there are some states, for example, California is notoriously very strict on who can own a medical corporation or who can own a business that's delivering the practice of medicine or medical services. And they are not only strict in what they say, but also in the enforcement of only
I see.
physicians are allowed to own practices that deliver medical care. And it's tricky for NPs because a lot of what we do falls under the practice of medicine because we are assessing, we're prescribing, we're diagnosing. And yes, we're trained in the nursing model and we are nurses first, but the actions that we're taking under the law fall under the practice of medicine. So that's an example, and California is an example of a state where, as a nurse practitioner, you not only you need a physician involved in your practice because they need to have part or complete ownership, technically, of the entity. So that's an example on the ownership side. Then on the medical oversight side, on a state by state basis, nurse practitioners have varying degrees of independent practice authority. So there are some states where, right out of school, upon being certified and licensed, you as an NP can practice completely independently without any agreements or oversight from a physician. So, Arizona, New Mexico, the Montanas, Utah, Idaho, these are all independent states for nurse practitioners. There are other states that have kind of a threshold, meaning that after a certain number of years or a certain number of hours, you are considered independent. So, I'm in one of those
Hmm,
states, I'm in Connecticut. So, in Connecticut, after 3 years and 2,000 hours of working collaboratively with a physician, an NP can be independent. New York is like that as well. And then there are some states that state based on specialty. So in Florida, for example, primary care nurse practitioners have a pathway to autonomy, but specialty ones don't. And then there's a third category of state where no matter what, as an NP, you have to have some degree of either an agreement or sometimes an in-person oversight requirement with a physician. So Texas is a good example of that, Georgia. So there are states where no matter how experienced you are, how long you've been practicing, you need to have a documented agreement with a physician. It doesn't mean that they need to be seeing all your patients or even have a
Mm,
physical presence where you're practicing, but there has to be a documented relationship between the NP and the physician.
okay. So the in-person oversight, so is it ever the case that they need to actually, I don't know, show up once a month at your practice and kind of audit you in a sense, or is that not necessarily the
There are a
case?
few kind of niche edge situations. For
Uh-huh.
example, in Alabama, until an NP has, I think, 4,000 hours of practice, that physician needs to be on site for 10% of the time. So they need to have a physical presence and kind of directly supervise in person. And there may be in Nevada something like that as well. So I wouldn't say that it's commonplace. The vast majority, these are remote collaborations, meaning you need to be able to access the physician for questions. There's a chart review component, but it's not really a
Mm.
synchronous type of relationship or something that's in person, except for those rare exceptions.
I wonder to what extent physicians are aware of the potential opportunity here. So, because it sounds like this is something that they could do in addition to, to their regular work, that they, they typically see patients at a practice, but they have this oversight capacity at, one or two or more nurse practitioner practices. So I wonder to what extent they know about the opportunity there.
Yeah, I think, many of them do know about it, fortunately, because in order for us to practice in many cases, we really do need their support and their oversight. So, there can be kind of varying degrees of opinion between, among physicians in terms of whether or not they support nurse practitioners practicing, independently or even without physicians on site. But, at Guardian MD, for example, that's really the bread and butter of our business. We have a roster, if you will, of physicians who are NP and nurse friendly, who are willing and able and happy to participate in assisting with that. And that's really what's best. We want physicians who want to be helpful, right? As opposed to physicians who are trying to shut us down.
Yeah, of course. That's really cool. I'm really glad that more people are going to hear about Guardian MD through this podcast episode. So the next question that comes to my mind is, so what's at stake here? As in, okay, I'm somebody listening to this. Maybe I didn't do my due diligence in terms of, what's the legal framework of running a nurse practitioner business, and then finding out I'm not in compliance with regards to some of these rules. What are the potential consequences?
It really depends on when and how that has been discovered. And
Uh huh.
to be honest, most of the investigations or inquiries that I've seen happen either come from some sort of complaint, meaning, a patient or even another provider has made a statement to the board saying, you know what, Amanda is not, she doesn't have a physician involved in her practice. She really needs to. Can you please investigate this? Right. So that tends to be what sparks a lot of the audits. Sometimes they're random, but that's what can be so tricky about all of this is that so much of it is on your honor until there's a complaint or an audit that there's not a great feedback loop for an NP to know whether or not they're doing everything right because there's not a submission or approval process. And some of that is advantageous, but it can be difficult for someone who wants to sleep well at night knowing that they, have all their compliance ducks in a row. So it's never too late to kind of audit your own compliance scenario because, there's only improvements to be made and at the end of the day, you want to be able to, defend yourself and your practice should there be an investigation or an inquiry.
Yeah, and you mentioned the potential first step here, for somebody who's either not sure or just going to start their own practice here would be to talk with a medical attorney, right?
Yes, I think talking with a seasoned healthcare attorney, particularly one who has experience in your state, is always a great first step if you are considering opening your practice or if you're or if you know that you're in a state that may have some interesting regulations or rules and you want to get a good answer. I see a lot of misinformation out there, and as much as I, like to use generative AI when appropriate, I've seen it be wrong. I
Yeah.
always have to fact check, and there are many cases where it's, pulling anecdotes as opposed to true regulatory information. So that's just a little pearl of wisdom. Please don't rely on that as your primary source, but you can't go wrong with a seasoned healthcare attorney.
Yeah, I've heard more than a couple horror stories already of people saying, "But well, ChatGPT is my attorney," and that's everything I need. So for that kind of specialist knowledge, by all means, talk with ChatGPT about your business vision. Help it kind of flesh out the details. It can be useful in that respect. Probably a little bit too optimistic, but still. But for specialist, medical law stuff, I would probably, yeah, probably talk with a medical attorney. And what that brings to my mind is we should definitely have somebody like that on the show. So yeah, I'll look for somebody like that to interview as well. That would be such an interesting conversation. Awesome, awesome. Thank you for sharing more about that. So to take another stay is to make another stop on our journey back to scaling then, because we talked a little bit about compliance. I feel like, in terms of where to get started, the first steps were like awareness of it. I feel like we have that covered. Let's go back to scaling. You said something interesting about like growing with staff. So, because typically you would start, I guess, with just yourself, right? The sole NP in the business. But then you might have it in your mind that you're adding more people to your nurse practitioner business to try to get to that multi-million dollar stage that we talked about. So how does scaling like that work? Is it a case of like there's typically, NP owners are hesitant to start adding more people, or what have you seen, and what would your advice be for somebody who has that ambition to scale with people?
I think that there are certain signals to look for in your business that prompt that you're ready, first of all, because I think it can
Okay.
be a common misconception that, oh, adding more providers will result in my business growing, which isn't necessarily the case unless those providers are bringing their own patients. Because ultimately, a provider that you have on staff needs to be revenue generating, right? Nurse practitioners in general, we're revenue generating providers. So, in order for there to be more money brought to the practice from another provider, there needs to be patients, right? For that provider to see. So, I think understanding that and keeping that in the forefront, and determining what the capacity threshold is going to be. That's really, I think, the primary signal is, okay, my schedule is full. I've got a 2 to 3 week wait list. Okay, that should then trigger in your mind, I need to make a change. It's not the only change to add. Adding another provider wouldn't be the only change, right? It could be a signal to increase prices if you're in a cash-based model, for example. So, thinking about what the different opportunities are for growth from that capacity signal is a good first step, and if it's going to be beneficial to the business for you to have some of your time freed up so that you can work on the business, then that capacity signal can be a bit lower than your schedule being, nearly 100% full, for example. But kind of going back to my original piece of advice of really marketing and understanding where your patients are going to come from, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in this potential scenario. If you're going to add another NP or another provider to your practice, how are you going to fill that provider's schedule so that the additional cost of that staff member is going to have a return?
Yeah, I mean, definitely finding the patience for that NP to work with is one part of the challenge. I do wonder about the other side of it, where it's about finding the NP in general. Like, how do you find somebody to partner up with? Is it like you're running your own solo business, I'm running my own solo business? Let's join forces. I imagine there's all sorts of scenarios, but any advice on finding a good other NP to work with?
I think that personal referrals and personal network is
Mm,
always the best first place to look for someone when you're hiring, and to your point, yes, there's a model where maybe someone doesn't want to keep growing and they like doing the patient care, they don't like the business aspect of things. Maybe there's a merger or a small acquisition that can happen, an acqui-hire or something to that effect. But otherwise, you know, looking to your network for referrals or recommendations of someone who has experience, who, you know, is also going to be up to the standards that you have for the culture of you're creating in your practice. And if you don't have anyone in your network or there aren't any referrals, there's definitely nothing wrong with going, the old fashioned route of posting a job posting and interviewing, or using a recruiter service or some sort of service to help you find the right person. I heard this a long time ago, to hire slow and fire fast. And I think
Yeah.
that's really good advice. So, having a runway for hiring and not doing it out of a place of urgency. So that's why I think establishing those signals early on of, okay, what's the capacity signal that I need to start looking at this, so that you don't end up hiring the first person who you come across because you're so desperate for the extra help. Is There's, a balance to be found there.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, some people being very in love with delivering the care, nothing wrong with that, definitely, especially not, in healthcare. It reminds me, once again, actually, on the show of the entrepreneurial operating system, EOS, because my mind was working on like what I would recommend for somebody like looking to just get better at running a business. This model is great, and you don't have to follow it to a T. I mean, they would say that you have to, right? And then, pay some special fees for that, for
Mhm.
the training, but it's very interesting inspiration. One thing that comes to mind here is like there's this concept of seats in EOS, and the three main seats are delivery, growth, and operations, right? And some people are just made for one of these seats. Me in particular, I of course love all the growth stuff. That's why I became head of marketing, right? But maybe you're more of a delivery person, and then for growth, you might want to hire somebody, and definitely for operations, typically that comes to doctors' minds, just in general, right? Or business owners' minds. I want somebody to just run the day to day, run the back office, right? An assistant, something to that extent. But it's another resource I would recommend today for that kind of thing. I was also going to ask. So one signal that you're ready to scale would be the full schedule and the wait list. Do you think there's other signals that you're ready to scale? Something more to add to the list?
I think that's definitely a main driver. Another signal could be different types of demand. So if the patients that you're currently seeing are asking for a different service, or indicating that there's something complementary that they need that you're not yet offering, then that kind of leads you down the path of service growth as opposed to like people growth. So I think those are different signals. And I think you can also anticipate different growth avenues based on what you're seeing, what you might see in your community or your clientele or the market or the industry, and being an early adopter of those things. I would just say, if you're going to do service growth, service line growth, best to validate before, for example, taking out a large loan on a device that the
Yeah.
rep promises you is going to completely change your life, right? So make sure that those signals are unbiased signals, so that you're not falling victim to something that may not have the demand.
Definitely. If you can, definitely validate first. Love that advice. All right. So the last stop on our journey that I would like to make here is to look a little bit to the future, right? Because I think, we were just in, I mean, I say just in, but it was like 6 years ago when COVID hit. Already? How is that possible? Six and a half, right? But then, the lockdown lasted for a couple years. And yeah, let's not think about the inevitable passage of time here. But in terms of compliance, the way COVID and lockdown influenced it, it seems like a lot of the regulations were loosened, right? And now we're kind of seeing that the trend is coming back, I think, to some extent. I would love to hear, from the perspective of somebody who's really much, much closer to this, where do you think this is going in terms of the compliance and regulations for this kind of subject matter for NP-based businesses? What do you think is going to change in the next few months or years that practice owners should prepare for?
It's been so interesting to watch and observe because, to your point, yes, during COVID, a lot of restrictions that were in place loosened or completely went away. For example, in pretty much every state, the requirement for a collaborating physician for an NP went away by mostly temporary executive order from state governors, for example.
Okay.
Additionally, there was automatic across state lines reciprocity granted for your license. So for example, if I'm only licensed in Connecticut, but want to go help and practice in New York because there was demand in New York, then those emergency orders also allowed for that. And I don't think anyone really expected any of those to be permanent, but it was definitely interesting to see the cascade of events following. Most of those emergency orders expired, but interestingly, the last one to expire or to be withdrawn only recently happened in the past 6 months in New Jersey. So New Jersey kind of
Ooh.
kept that allowance for NPs to practice without a collaborating physician for a long time, and it has now since moved into something that's been codified in their law to some extent. So there are some states that were able to say, "Hey, we took this away temporarily. We didn't see any negative outcomes. Maybe it makes sense for us to codify something more permanent in the regulation around this area." And some states have done that. Not nearly as many as you might have thought. And in fact, there are some states that seem to be going in the opposite direction. Georgia is one of them in particular, which just last month came out with a statement that clarifies some of their collaboration rules in a way that makes it uh, more restrictive or less open to interpretation than it was before. So I think it's an interesting observation to make, and you can't really say that there's one predictable trend at this point because I think it ultimately comes down to the state environment, particularly the power or the lobbying power that nurse organizations have versus the lobbying power that the physician organizations have. That's really kind of the common thread that I've seen among all of these changes around practice environments, um, either making them stricter or looser for nurse practitioners. It typically has to do with how powerful or supported either of those organizations or those lobbies end up being. So it's definitely an interesting state. Um, I would I'd like to think that overall, looking into the future, we'll see more net progress than not because that's what we've seen so far. I think the progress has outweighed the setbacks, but I guess time will tell.
Yeah, so I guess the main takeaway here is to just stay informed, right? Like hopefully somebody listening to this will check for what's coming down the pipeline in terms of regulations or what's the latest news. Are there good sources of such news? Like is there a newsletter or something?
Yes. So a big piece of advice that I have to all professionals is to join your state professional organization. So that might
Mm.
be for NPs, it might be a state level nurse practitioner association or a nursing association for physicians. There are physician ones. So not only join, the fees are usually not a lot of money, but that not only supports the group of professionals of your colleagues who are doing the advocacy and policy work to advance your organization, but also gets you access to this information. And they are really, most are doing a good job of keeping those updates coming out by email and other methods of communication so that you can stay informed on not only your profession, but your professional environment in your specific state, since that is typically the most kind of applicable to what you're able to do day in and day out.
That is such solid advice. I'm so glad I asked. And you know what? I'm thinking that's another thread to pull on in terms of future guests for the show, right? Somebody from an organization like that probably would make a very interesting conversation. I'll keep looking. I'm looking for
Hmm.
guests. If you're in one of those organizations listening right now, reach out to me, talkie.ai. You'll find the podcast there, or just find me on LinkedIn, Jakub Grajcar. And we're kind of getting into that part of the show, actually, Amanda. Thank you so much for the conversation. You've got such deep knowledge about this. This was such a pleasure to tap into that for at least, a brief moment here. For somebody who wants more, wants to hear more from you, where can they find you and follow you and your business says?
Yes, I would say the best place to follow me is on LinkedIn. I'm decently active there, and I'd love to connect with anyone who is interested in connecting back. So you can simply search my name, Amanda Guarniere, on LinkedIn, and you will definitely find me there.
Yes, watchers and listeners, and you don't even have to do that because we will drop Amanda's LinkedIn right in the show notes. So go there for all the links. I'll list all the books we mentioned here. Yeah, did you have something maybe to add to the pile? Because it's been from my end this today like the best book to read for somebody who's in this business.
Yeah, I have read most of the ones you mentioned, so definitely cosign those. I think to introduce a good mindset book, which I think is as important as our business education, The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks is what I'd like
Ooh,
to suggest. So it's kind of about pushing through what your perceived upper limit is in terms of what's possible, but it also helps you examine the difference between not only what you're good at, but what you're great at. So it defines your zones of competence, your zone of versus your zone of excellence, which is really what we should all be striving to tap into and spend the most of our time in because it affects the most change, but also makes us most fulfilled. Because just because you're good at it doesn't mean that it's your special zone where you should be all the time.
that's excellent. No pun intended. But I'm so glad I asked again. And do you know what? I mean, I'm gonna say it. I feel like I'm in my zone of excellence when I'm having conversations like these. So glad and so grateful to be running this podcast, and a little bit sad that this episode is coming to an end. So that's it, watchers and listeners. Sorry, did you have any other links or like calls to action to drop? Yeah.
No, that's it.
Okay, great. Anything else? We'll drop it in the show notes. And that's it for today. Amanda, thank you so, so much for coming in the show. Great conversation. Loved it. And you watchers and listeners, thank you so, so, so much for joining us here today. This has been Scaling Practice Management, and I have been Jakub Grajcar, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.